speaking, the hardest decision to make is how you start. In America, you begin with a joke. In Asia, you begin with an apology. So what I do, I combine the two traditions and I apologize for my bad joke. But my bad joke is actually a true story. Many years ago, when I was the permanent secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is like the CEO of the ministry, one of my colleagues in another ministry, Mr. Tan, went to China. So when he arrived in China, he called on his counterpart, Vice Minister, and he introduced himself in English and said, "I'm Mr. Tan and I'm the permanent secretary of this ministry." So there's a young Chinese lady translator there. She looked very puzzled and she was trying to figure out how do you translate permanent secretary into Chinese. Then she finally said, "Oh, this guy says he's Mr. Tan and he says that he's the eternal typist from Singapore." So permanent secretary became eternal typist in Chinese. Now I begin with that story actually for a deliberate reason, because if you can have cultural misunderstanding between Singapore, which is 75% Chinese, and China, which is 100% Chinese, you realize you have a problem in our hand. And that's, in a sense, some of what I'm going to be talking about today, about some of the major misunderstandings in the world that are emerging. But don't worry, I'll try to end with good news, so don't worry too much. So this is what I propose to do. The question I've been posed is, what is international diplomacy? And I propose to answer the question in three parts. Firstly, what is the international context today? Exactly. Secondly, the question I'll answer is, what is diplomacy? And thirdly, I'll talk about what we should do, or rather more accurately, what you should do. Right? I'm already 70 years old, so I've had a good life. The question is whether or not all of you will have in the next 40 to 50 years. When you become 70, will you have a good life or not? So that's what I hope to address, how you can create a better lives for yourselves or so. So let me begin by talking and addressing the question, what is the international context? And this is actually surprising. In theory, it's an easy question to answer, but in practice it's very difficult, because you can make the case that we live in the best of times, and you can make the case that we live in the worst of times. So this is the paradoxical world that we live in. So let me begin by talking how we live in the best of times. And I'm going to mention, by the way, I'll just show it to you. I did come out with a very short book. I want to show it to you so you can read it in 1 hour. It's called Has the West Lost It? And in this book, surprisingly, there is a lot of good news in the book. Let me give you 3 examples. Now, since human history began, the one thing that all societies worried about was that would they go to war? Would lives be lost in wars? And it was a case, by the way, in the 20th century, for example, the biggest wars were fought. And if you were living in a world, this is now 2019. If you were living in 1919, 100 years ago, you would have just come out through one of the most devastating wars, World War I, where millions and millions of people were killed. So the question obviously is, do we face the danger of millions and millions of people dying in interstate wars? Now, here is the good news. Your chances of dying in an interstate war are practically zero. Major interstate wars have become a sunset industry. right? And if you want proof, there's a Harvard professor whom I quote in my book, Steven Pinker. He's written 2 books, The Better Angels of Our Nature and Enlightenment Now. He gives you data that shows maybe in the 1950s, people, 65,000, maybe 70,000 people were dying in interstate wars. Now it's less than a couple of thousand people dying in interstate wars. So that's one piece of good news. And indeed, anyone who was living in 1919, and if he came alive in 2019, he said, this is heaven. Nobody's dying in wars. That's an amazing improvement in the world. Now, the second way in which the world has improved is that in 1950, right, which is not too long ago, but 2 years after I was born, 75% of the world lived in extreme poverty. By the way, including me too. In fact, I was Singapore's per capita income in the 1950s was the same as Ghana, about $500. And when I went to school at the age of 6, I was put on a special feeding program because I was technically undernourished. Now you can see I'm overnourished. So that's the world that was in 1950. Today, less than 10% of the world's population lives in extreme poverty, and by 2030, the National Intelligence Council of the United States has predicted that it'll come down to probably 0. Now I can tell you this, development economists were thinking for decades, how do we eliminate poverty, how do we eliminate poverty? People thought it couldn't be done, you know. But the remarkable thing that it has been done, and when I was the ambassador to the UN in the year 2000 and we established the Millennium Development Goals, one of the Millennium Development Goals was to halve global poverty by 2015, and we exceeded that goal. So that's another way in which the world has become better. And then if you look at another indicator of how much the world has progressed, and you look at the global middle-class populations. Now I want to emphasize one factor. For most of human history, going back thousands of years, the number of people who would enjoy the kind of comfortable lifestyle that all of you are enjoying would be less than 1% of the population, right? Very tiny. Most people led very hard lives, and their life expectancy was 30, 40 years old, you know. But today, the global middle class population is already 1.8 billion out of 7.5 billion. By 2020, it's going to hit 3.2 billion. And by 2030, it will be 4.9 billion. So more than half the world's population is going to enjoy global middle class living standards. And believe me, any future historian looking back at human history over the past 30 years would say that the past 30 years of human history have been better than the past 300 years or the past 3,000 years of human history. Quite remarkable. We live in remarkable times. And the question, of course, is why this is happening, and then I discuss that also in my book, and I speak about it, and it's about what I call one of the things, of course, as you know, the first civilization to succeed was Western civilization, through the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution. Initially, the West used the power to colonize, to dominate the world, but after that, it shared the gifts of Western wisdom with the rest of the world, and over time, the spread of what I call the gifts of Western wisdom have improved the world dramatically. And again, there have been many what I call silent revolutions, like, for example, the spread of good governance throughout the world. Governments around the world, in all your countries, are building things like roads, bridges, ports, hospitals, schools. So there's a progressive improvement in the human condition as a result of the spread of what I call some Western ideas, and the world is getting better and better. So you can see you should all be happy and celebrating and say, hey, we live in the best of times. So now let me give you some bad news. Why do we live in the worst of times. We live in the worst of times because we are actually going to face some very serious challenges, both on the geopolitical front and on the domestic front. Again, I'll give you 3 examples again. On the geopolitical front, I can assure you for sure that in the next 10 years at least, you'll be obsessed between the competition, obsessed with the competition between the world's #1 power today, which is the United States of America, and the world's #1 emerging power, which is China. And that will be, in one way or another, will affect all your lives, no matter where you are. And I can say that with some confidence, because one of the reasons why you might notice I'm looking very relaxed today is because I sent off my 88,000-word manuscript to my publisher in New York. It's a book on US-China relations. It'll be coming out in spring next year. Please Google and buy it right away, even before it goes to print. Political front is going to be played out in the military front, is going to be played out in the cultural front, and also in what I call the primacy front. So it's a multi-dimensional struggle that is about to break out between the United States and China. And you'll find that countries will have to choose. I'll give you a very simple example. You're all, so far you notice I've been very good. I haven't mentioned President Donald Trump once. I will be mentioning him later. But just to illustrate to you that this has nothing to do with Trump, even when the United States had a very reasonable, kind, peaceful president like Barack Obama, right? Surely you'll agree he's a very nice guy. But even in his time, when China decided to create something called the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, and Asia, by the way, needs an infrastructure bank because Asia has got to spend trillions of dollars on infrastructure. China agrees to set up a bank to help Asians build infrastructure. And because China proposes, the United States opposes. And sure enough, all the countries got a phone call saying, don't join, very dangerous, Chinese bank, don't join. And sure enough, Australia didn't join, Japan didn't join, South Korea didn't join, but surprisingly, almost all the other Asian countries joined, and even the best friend of United States, well, best friend until last week, was United Kingdom. United Kingdom joined also. And so that was a sign of that's the kind of trouble that you get when a competition breaks out between the United States and China. And more countries will have to make more and more painful decisions on more and more subjects as the conflict, as the competition builds up. So that's clearly one major geopolitical tension that we have to learn to live with. The second one is more delicate, and it's a bit harder to speak about because it's politically incorrect. But there is also, as you know, some kind of geopolitical fault line between the West and the Islamic world, right? And it's, of course, as you know, there have been all kinds of wars in so many Islamic countries that have been going on for the last 2 decades, especially since 9/11 happened in New York in 2001. And I actually know the impact of 9/11 because I was in Manhattan when 9/11 happened, and I know the shock and pain and grief that the American people felt, and as a result of the shock and the pain and grief, the United States reacted angrily, and first it launched a war in Afghanistan, and that war in Afghanistan is considered under international law legitimate because the United Nations Security Council endorsed and said, yes, United States has a right to retaliate when it is attacked, and so he invaded Afghanistan. But then 2 years later, the United States invaded Iraq, and that war is considered illegitimate because the United Nations Security Council did not endorse that war. In fact, it was my good friend who sadly passed away, Kofi Annan, who bravely said that the Iraq war is illegal, for which he suffered a great deal, but he told the truth. So, but that's just two examples, and since then there have been many other wars also between the West and the Islamic world. And this is another fault line. So I hope in the Q&A period you can ask me some questions on these issues, and I'm happy to discuss them. My only request is please try to think of the most difficult question. Because I find the more difficult the question, the easier the answer. The easier the question, the harder to answer. It's a real paradox. So I actually would prefer you to come out openly and speak about what's on your mind. Now, so far, the two challenges I've spoken about are the geopolitical challenges, but there's also a third challenge, which I also actually discuss in my book, Has the West Lost It? And the reason why I chose that title is that what is very puzzling is that the most successful civilization, as I said earlier, has been the West, and the West has always led the world in many ways for the last 200 years. Now what's surprising is that it is Western societies that are not progressing, but regressing. And what do I mean by regressing? I mean that they are electing populist governments. Governments that are, in a sense, instead of working to create international programs that work with the rest of the world, they are creating programs that work against the rest of the world. And this is where, of course, President Donald Trump comes in, because he actually believes that all the institutions of global governance, all the multilateral institutions that were gifts from the West to the rest after World War II, he sees them as being anti-American. So in one way or another, he's attacking every international institution. He's also attacking fundamental principles of global governance, like free trade is good for everybody. He is imposing tariffs, and what's interesting is that he's not just imposing tariffs on China, he's imposing tariffs on the two best friends the United States has, Canada and Mexico, and also on Europe and on Japan, And I just met someone who had a conversation with Gary Cohn. Gary Cohn is a former chairman of the National Economic Advisors Council, I think it's called. And one day Gary Cohn sat down with Donald Trump and tried to explain to him what you call Economics 101. Economics 101 teaches you that tariffs is bad, because that's how you get the Great Depression, and you should actually minimize the use of tariffs, and you should encourage free trade. That's Economics 101. So after he explained that to President Trump said, no, I'm sorry, I'm not going to change. So Gary Cohn asked him, why are you doing this? And Donald Trump replied, I like tariffs. He just enjoys it. It's a weapon. He uses it, and uses it, I must say, indiscriminately. And of course, if this carries on, then frankly, there is a danger for the world. And what's surprising is that we thought we only had one populist leader to deal with. In a few weeks' time, we may have another populist leader to deal with, who might actually outshine President Donald Trump, and his name is Boris Johnson. And if you had told me even 10 years ago that United States would elect Donald Trump and UK would elect Boris Johnson, I would have said no way. But it's a different world. You can see that's coming. So we can maybe in the Q&A talk about why this is happening. So that's the international context. So let me now turn to the second question. What is diplomacy? And here I must say that I was a diplomat for 33 years. And I must say I was reasonably good at it. But when I had to prepare for speaking here, when I had to ask myself, what is diplomacy? The strange thing is that I know how to do it, but I cannot find the words to describe what it is. It's very difficult. It's a very strange profession. So what I did, of course, I went to the font of all wisdom, Wikipedia. And this is the Wikipedia definition. It says, diplomacy is the professional activity or skill of managing international relations, typically for a country's representatives abroad. Now, what does that mean? Right? You don't kind of say. So let me tell you what. Let me tell you two things about diplomacy. One, I'll try and explain what diplomats do, and then I'll explain the 3 levels of diplomacy. But I must say, this is in preparing for today's talk, I realized that what the world lacks is a good book on diplomacy. So maybe I'll try and write one after this talk. So what do diplomats do? There are 3 things at least that they do. So when I go, I've been an ambassador. So when you arrive as an ambassador or as a diplomat in a country, the first thing you need to do, of course, is to understand the country. To persuade people that my country is the best country in the world. So that's what you do. And you can be quite innovative in the ways you do it. Let me give you an example. When I was ambassador to UN, my counterpart then was a French ambassador before he came to New York. He was the French ambassador to Netherlands, and when he arrived in Netherlands, he wanted to make sure that everyone in Netherlands knew who he was. So he went around Netherlands asking, who's the most popular person in Netherlands? Who's the most famous person in Netherlands? So you might think he's looking for maybe the philosopher or the fashion designer or whatever. And instead he found that the most popular person in Netherlands was the cycling champion. Netherlands, as you know, is a country of bicycles. If you've been to Amsterdam, you don't get run down by cars in Amsterdam, you get run down by bicycles. It's a fact. So the cycling champion of the Netherlands was the #1 hero in Netherlands. So of course what the French ambassador did was to convey a French award on the most popular person in Netherlands, and everyone in Netherlands thought, gosh, this French ambassador is so wonderful. So he succeeded in his mission of marketing his country. But that's an example of what a diplomat can do. And of course the third thing that a diplomat does is to solve problems. And it is not a secret. Many countries have issues, bilateral problems, bilateral issues, and they have to sit down and talk to each other and find solutions. So that's also what diplomats do. Now this might seem like something so obvious, right? If you have a problem, we should sit down and talk about it, right? You all agree, right? Does anyone disagree? Nobody. Why do you disagree?
Hello. I don't necessarily disagree. It's just sometimes you sit down and talk with someone. When you hear something, you need to be ready to listen, and some people aren't ready to listen. So sometimes talking with the wrong people exhausts you. It's just not very tactical always. So I don't fully disagree. There's a clause.
Okay.
Yeah.
Partially disagree. Okay. But anyway, the reason I tell that story is, diplomacy was invented. And by the way, you all know that diplomacy is the world's 2nd oldest profession, right? By the way, do you all know what the oldest profession is? Okay, I won't say it. It is, but there's no relationship between the world's oldest profession and the world's 2nd oldest profession. So anyway, diplomacy was invented not to enable you to talk to your friends. Diplomacy was invented to enable you to talk to your enemies, because the most important part of being a diplomat is that when you arrive in a capital as a diplomat, you get diplomatic immunity. Now, diplomatic immunity is very important because in the old days, before diplomatic conventions came about, when you were sent as an ambassador to an enemy capital, quite often the enemy king would get angry with the ambassador and chop off his head. This is quite common in the old days. Ambassadors would get their heads chopped off. It was a difficult job to do. But over time, we realized that was very stupid, because if you chop off the heads of ambassadors, then you can't talk to the ambassador, right? Without his head, it's very difficult to talk to him. So developed the concept of diplomatic immunity. Now, I want to emphasize this concept of diplomatic immunity because the concept of diplomatic immunity makes it very clear that the only purpose of diplomacy is to talk to your enemies. Now, this is commonsensical, and virtually all countries follow this principle except one country. That one country is the most advanced, developed, modern country in the world. It is the United States of America. Now, why is it the United States of America? Because every country believes you should talk. If you have an enemy, you establish an embassy in that country. United States has declared Cuba as an enemy. It doesn't have an embassy in Cuba. The United States says that Iran is an enemy. It doesn't have an embassy in Iran. It says that North Korea is an enemy. It doesn't have an embassy in North Korea, which goes against all the fundamental principles of what diplomacy is supposed to be about. It's supposed to enable you to talk to your enemies, which is why I think that President Donald Trump should be praised for talking to the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-nam, right? That was a very wise thing for him to do, right? And of course, as you know, he was criticized for doing that. And people say, you know, why is he doing it? Why is he talking to a dictator? But that's the whole point. You don't talk to people who are like you. You talk to people who are unlike you, who are the opposite of you. And that's what diplomacy is about. And so solving problems is also what diplomacy is all about. But at the same time, I can also tell you that there are many other levels of complexity, because in today's world, you have many, many types of diplomacy, and I noticed in your program, you're talking about different types of diplomacy, but I'm going to talk about 3 different levels of diplomacy, and they're very different actually. The first level is bilateral diplomacy within 2 countries. The second level is regional diplomacy. And then the third level is multilateral diplomacy, like what you do at the United Nations and so on and so forth. And I have done bilateral diplomacy, I've done regional diplomacy, I've done multilateral diplomacy, and all 3 are very, very different. So even if you take, for example, I had 3 bilateral postings as a diplomat. First time I went to Singapore's Chargé d'Affaires to Phnom Penh, Cambodia. It was by far the most exciting posting I had, because when I was there in Phnom Penh from 1973 to 74, the city was shelled every day by the Khmer Rouge that was surrounding the city. So once I was in my house, and we had French working hours, because you know the French had Cambodia was a French colony. You had siestas in the afternoon, so I went home for a siesta, and some dissident pilot decided to bomb the palace, near where I was staying. So when the 500-pound bomb fell on the palace, my bed went up in the air, threw me up in the air. I fell down. I ran down to under the staircase. By the way, if you're ever in a house that is close to a bombing goal, and then we got divorced, and after we got divorced, we continued to live in the same house. We couldn't move away. So we have a neurotic relationship. So when I became the Deputy High Commissioner there, I was treated with some degree of distrust, suspicion, and so on and so forth, which is normal. And then from there, I went to Washington, D.C., and in Washington, D.C., Americans love Singapore. So I went from a city where I was treated with distrust and suspicion to a city where everyone loved me. So I'm telling you this story so that, diplomacy depends a lot on context, right? The context you are in makes a huge difference to what you have to do. So in bilateral diplomacy, it depends on whether you're going to a country that is very friendly to you or a country that is hostile to you. But my recommendation to you is if you ever have to choose a posting in a country that is hostile to you. It's more interesting, more challenging. Don't pick a country that's friendly, that's boring, because there's no work to be done. Then you come to regional diplomacy. And regional diplomacy, surprisingly, is very, very difficult. And the surprising thing is that in theory, we should all be welcoming regional organizations, but in practice, most regional organizations fail, right? I mean, I don't know which parts of the world you want to talk about. You have something called the South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation, right? And it's struggling because India and Pakistan cannot talk to each other or have great difficulty talking to each other. So SAARC is, moribund. And then, okay, I can also give you an example. You have the Gulf Cooperation Council, and you have problems within Saudi Arabia and Qatar, right? So, and then I can go on. And the amazing thing is that the most successful regional organization in the world by far is the European Union. But amazingly, the European Union is about to break apart. The United Kingdom is leaving. Shocking, right? It's amazing. So, which is the one regional organization in the world that is now the most successful regional organization in the world? Huh? ASEAN, of course. Good answer. Absolutely correct. It was, by the way, ASEAN was founded in Bangkok, here, on August 8th, 1967. And I can recommend to you a book called The ASEAN Miracle, which I co-authored with a friend of mine who lives in Bangkok. And the amazing thing about ASEAN is that ASEAN was designed to fail. Why was it designed to fail? Now, you know that there are 7.5 billion people on planet Earth, right? Now, you can travel to any corner of planet Earth. You can go to Latin America, you can go to Africa, you can go to Central Asia, you can go to Europe, you can go anywhere. There's no part in the world which is as diverse as Southeast Asia is. Because out of 650 million people, you have 240 million Muslims, 150 million Christians, 150 million Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists, you have Hindus, you have Taoists, you have Confucianists, and of course Southeast Asia also has got a lot of communists. So it is the most diverse corner of planet Earth. And this is where regional organizations should fail. But ASEAN has ended up being the most successful regional organization. That's why it's a remarkable success story that you should all get to know, because if there's one regional organization that should be a model for the rest of the world, it is today ASEAN. And if you want a place where Christians and Muslims can work together, it's ASEAN. So that's an example of why ASEAN matters. So that's regional diplomacy. And then, of course, you also have what I call multilateral diplomacy, which is what we do at the United Nations. Now, you will find that everybody likes to rubbish the United Nations. I actually believe that the hope for the future lies in organizations like the United Nations. And I'm a passionate defender of the UN and what it does and what it can do, which is why it's very appropriate that we are meeting here under the auspices of the UN. So let me conclude now by telling you what, in a sense, are the three things we should be doing for you, for the rest, for all of you. If you want to create a better world in the next 30 to 40 years, what should you be doing? I think the first thing you need to do is to change the mindsets of the people of the world of how international relations should work. Now, what do I mean by changing our mindsets? And I use a very simple boat analogy to explain what the change of mindset requires. In the past, when 7.5 billion people lived in 193 separate countries, it was as though they were living in 193 separate boats, right? And so, as you know, when you're on a boat, you have captains and crews who take care of the boat, and normally you have rules to make sure that boats don't collide in the world. And that's what I call the 1945 rules-based order. Now, what's happened is that in the last 70 or years plus, the world has shrunk. It has become very small, very interdependent place. So now the 193 countries are no longer on 193 separate boats. The 7.5 billion people who live in 193 separate countries are now living in 193 separate cabins on the same boat. But the problem with this global boat is that you have captains and crews taking care of each cabin, and no captain or crew taking care of the global boat as a whole. And that's absurd, because all the challenges that are coming for your generation, there's absolutely no doubt that your biggest challenges will be challenges that affect the whole boat, not challenges that affect your cabin alone. And if you stay in your cabin, you will not be able to fix that problem. You have to come out and collaborate with everybody else. I mean, I can give you some examples. The most obvious example is global warming. You can't solve global warming in any country. You have to work with the whole world, right? Similarly, if you have a pandemic that spreads, it can go around the world instantly. And you know, Singapore experienced it, I think in 2003 or something, when you had the SARS virus. It started in a small village in China. From China went to Hong Kong, and from Hong Kong went simultaneously to two cities on opposite sides of the world, exactly opposite sides of the world, Singapore and Toronto. So that's how we are now on the same boat. So the question is, if we are on the same boat, why aren't we taking